Join me today for a step-by-step tutorial on how to paint this watercolor galaxy. Hello, my friends. This is Nefer Kefri, the Positive Vibes artist. I'm here today participating in a journaling collaboration with Helen Colebrook of Journal with Purpose. Helen and I met over on Instagram and become pretty good friends, and I really admire her work. She's extremely creative. I do recommend you follow her on Instagram, and she also has a Patreon. Both are called Journal with Purpose, and I will link to her below. But every month, what Helen does for her patrons is she publishes a list of journaling prompts. And for the month of November, there were two of the prompts that we decided to work on are the Galaxy prompt and Splatters. Now, what I decided to do for my half of our collaboration is to film a tutorial for you on how to paint a watercolor galaxy. I have painted quite a few in my time. It is actually my favorite thing to paint. And I'm often asked over on Instagram, how do you paint your galaxies? Well, I'm going to show you my little tips and tricks. First of all, I'm going to go over the materials. The items that you see here are everything that I'm going to use to paint this watercolor galaxy. Now, first of all, there's the water, and you're probably wondering, why are there two containers of water? That's because it's important to have a dirty water container and a clean water container, because in order to activate your watercolors, you don't want to be adding dirty water to them. So the clean water is for activating watercolors, and the dirty water, this water here, is for me to rinse out my brush. Now, also speaking of brushes, what you'll need is a brush that can hold a fair amount of water. This is a 6 round, and it's by Artegria. It's their Intuition brush, and they are available on Amazon. I will link to those below. And then, if you have it, a flat brush. And this one is by Fumui, I think. They're also on Amazon. I will link to their brushes below. These are both inexpensive brushes, and they're really, really nice. I like them. I use them a lot. And I would also recommend some either watered down white acrylic paint or another acrylic based paint like Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. And that will be for the stars. Also for the stars, what you're going to need is a toothbrush. And the toothbrush should have pretty firm bristles. This one I got in a pack of 20 at the dollar store, and I just use these for spatters, which is one of the journaling prompts that Helen and I are working with today. We're doing galaxies and spatters. And the paints here, the watercolors, are handmade by Boulder Colors. She's on Instagram. I will link to Amanda below as well. And what's unique about her paint is that she creates her own pigments from plants and food. Yeah, so all of these are 100% natural. Some of her paints are even edible, if you can believe that. So these are the colors I will be using for the galaxy. I probably will not use all the colors in this particular tin. I have a large collection of her colors. I have like over 60 now. And they're absolutely gorgeous colors, and they're so beautiful. You'll see when we paint the galaxy here. But this is what I'm using. These are handmade. You can use pretty much any brand of watercolor paint. Store-bought brand that I recommend is Art Philosophy, also known as Prima Watercolors. Those are excellent for galaxies, and I've actually in the past used those quite a bit. Another name brand easily found in stores is Daniel Smith. That's also an excellent brand to use. And again, you know, these brands are at various price points, and you'll find something that you can afford and that you like. For the paper, I'm using Artist Loft by Michael's, which is a chain of craft stores here in America. And this is 140 pound. That's what you'll need in order to do a galaxy painting, 140 pound, and ideally the paper should be cold press. The reason you want the paper to be cold press, in watercolor there is cold press, hot press, and rough. The hot press is very, very smooth. Think of a mixed media type paper. That's what hot press is like. It doesn't have much of a tooth to it. Rough is extremely toothy. It's pretty much all tooth, while cold press is in between hot press and rough. So it has a little bit of a tooth and just enough to where you'll be able to get some nice texture with your paint. So this is what you'll need, 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. And this Artist Lofts, it's really inexpensive and it's actually pretty nice paper. I mean, I like it better than the Canson 140 pound cold press. So I highly recommend this. I'll be using this. And that's it. And now we will get into the tutorial portion of the video. What I did is I removed the watercolor paper from the pad and I used painter's tape, which you can get at any art supply store. Also, places, you know, like Home Depot and home repair stores will also sell it. And I use it to demarcate the edges of the paper so that my painting will end up having a straight edge. You don't have to do that with yours. A lot of people like a more organic edge to their paintings, but I always prefer the straight edge, so I always tape off my paper. And this sheet is 9 by 12. I am not doing a 9 by 12 painting because it would just take too long. This video would go on forever. I'm going to do basically what amounts to 6 by 9, so I'll only be painting 1/2 of this page for you. Now, another thing you'll need will be a cloth or a paper towel to clean off your brush as you're painting. And now I'll take you through the first preliminary steps here. All right, the first thing you'll want to do is activate your watercolors. And we do this by dipping a dropper into the clean water and deciding what colors you're going to use. I like to paint a little nebula in my galaxies, so I'll always start them off with a light color. So I'm going to use this pink here, which is made from the root of beets. So it's called beetroot. And I'm going to use this darker pink, this fuchsia, and this comes from red cabbage, believe it or not. And I think I'll move outward from that nebula and use this purple potato. And I'll use red cabbage number 4. So I'll activate that one. And let's see. I think I'll use smoke tree. Now, it takes a few seconds for your watercolors to activate depending on the brand. If they're pan colors, they can take anywhere from a minute to 4 minutes. If they're in a tube, of course, you know, they're already in soft form and you just squeeze a little bit out onto your palette and add water to it. Now for your galaxy, while my paints are activating, I'm going to prep the paper. This is where the flat brush comes in real handy. You can do it with a larger round brush if you have like a size 10 or a size 12 would work really well for this. But I just got into the habit of using flatter brushes, and so that's what I do. So you just dip it again in your clean water. This is why it's important to have a container of clean water. And you just simply apply the water to your paper. You are prepping the surface. The paper needs to be wet, but not soaking wet. You don't want the water pooling on your paper. You also do not want to put so much water on the paper that the paper begins to warp. And this is why it's important to use 140 pound cold press paper. It will not warp on you, especially if you tape down the edges. That will definitely prevent warping. And I will tilt this in the light so you can see how the surface of the paper glistens. You see that from my ring light? this is how your paper should look. And look for dry areas. And make sure you've got some water over there and just spread it out over the whole paper. Now, as you're working on your galaxy, the paper is going to start to dry. Simply dip a clean brush in your clean water and add a little bit more water to it as you go along. So I'm just going to leave that in my clean water for now. Also, it's never recommended to leave your brushes in water because that will warp the bristles. So remember that when you're done, take it out of the water. Now this is my clean watercolor brush. I'm dipping it into the clean water, and I'm going to go with the lightest color I have here, which is the beetroot. And I'm just going to dip it on there and get some on the brush. A pretty, fairly generous amount there. And I'm just going to decide, I like my nebulas pretty much in the center. I'm going to drop it, and you see how the paint is spreading a little bit as it comes into contact with the water on the paper. Isn't that pretty? I just love Boulder Colors watercolors. They're all so pretty. And you just, basically what you're doing is taking the side of the brush and you're tapping the paint onto the paper. Just tap, 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 tap. And you want some variation in shading. You want some lighter areas and you want some darker areas. So there's the start of my nebula. And I will go now to the container for my dirty water here and rinse out my brush. And then I'll go to the next darker color, which is the red cabbage here. This ought to be interesting. I have not tried to do a galaxy painting with these particular colors. So we'll all be seeing what this looks like together for the first time. And again, it's just tap, tap, tap. That's all you're doing. You don't need to know how to paint in order to paint a watercolor galaxy. The only thing you need to know is pretty much what colors will look good together. And if you have any doubts of that, just consult a watercolor wheel, a color wheel. And that will tell you. And again, you can put the paint anywhere. I tend to follow the initial shape of the nebula, and then I just kind of fan it out and allow the color to spread across my page. Now, I do notice it's drying off down here in the corner. Well, and I'm going to just add some clean water. Now, the paint will kind of smear and get into the other parts of the page, but that's okay because we're going to be adding darker colors, and this slightly pinkish hue is going to get covered up. Then you go to a darker color. I'm going to use this darker shade of red cabbage here. And again, you're just tapping and watch it blend out into the water. I mean, isn't that pretty? And let it do its thing. That is the fun of doing a watercolor galaxy. You never really quite know how it's going to turn out. You have an idea, you kind of, if you're going to do a nebula, you kind of know where the nebula is going to go. But after that, you really don't know what those paints are going to do. And that to me is the fun part. Also, it can be interesting sometimes too, what I've noticed in my paintings is sometimes I'll have shapes show up. I once did a watercolor galaxy. It is now sold. The head of a horse showed up and it was pretty definite. And the woman who bought it from me she was convinced I painted it into the galaxy, and I never did that. So that was interesting how a horse showed up. Now I've noticed that my colors are kind of drying out a little bit here, so I'm just going to add a little bit more water. Just to keep them liquefied a little bit. But look at this. I mean, That's just incredible. You know, again, you just never know what the paint's going to do and how different colors are going to react with one another. And I'm getting like this nice little peach effect here and down through here with the beetroot mixing with the red cabbage. So then we just continue on adding color. And what I tend to do with mine, I tend to start with light in the center and move outward in ever increasing depth and darkness of color. So the darker colors are going to be out around the edge. And then if I want to add some additional definition later on, I'll actually go in with a dark color in the middle here and perhaps add a bit of, darker areas, and that will help the nebula area to pop a bit more. And this color here is Smoke Tree, and it's kind of like an indigo color. Now, when you're painting galaxies, if you saw what happened just here, the water started to pool here along the tape. I just pulled it back into the painting. Because again, there's a lot of forgiveness with painting a watercolor galaxy. There is no exact science to it. And again, you're just tap, tap, tapping with the side of your brush. That's all you're doing as you add the color. And I will be getting the edges a little bit darker. This is pretty much a first coat. And that's the thing about a watercolor galaxy. If you want one that has depth to it, you're going to want to do it in more than one layer of color. You don't have to, but it does give it a little bit more depth. And then when you add the stars, it just, I think, in my opinion, it just looks so much nicer. And then what you do to add that other layer of color, you just go back into the colors you've used and add them again right on top of themselves. So here I am adding the beetroot into the center of the nebula. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush. And I'm going to add the red cabbage. And there may be areas of your painting you don't want to change, and that's perfectly fine. Then don't add any more paint to that area if you don't want it to look a little bit different. And again, if you see any areas starting to dry up, just add a little bit of clean water to that area after you've rinsed off your brush. Just pick up some clean water and add it in. So far, this paper is doing really well, so I don't anticipate having to add much water to it. Just a little bit down here. I don't know why right along here it keeps wanting to dry up on me. That's kind of weird. So again, I dip into the clean water. Now, when you add water to a watercolor painting, it is going to lift some of that color. But again, that's okay because you're going to be adding more. Now, when you feel that your galaxy is done, there is one of two things you can do. You can either allow it to dry naturally, which is what I recommend, or you can use a heat gun or a hair dryer. Just keep in mind, if there is a lot of water on the paper and you're using a heat gun, that heat gun might make that water move on the paper, and therefore it would move the color on the paper as well. Will move the paint. So you have to be really careful when using a heat gun when you're painting watercolor galaxies because, you don't want the water to be moving around on the paper after you've laid your paint down because it'll change the look of your galaxy. And sometimes, depending on the colors you're using too, it can also muddy up your colors. And then I'm pretty much going to call this layer done, and I will let it dry, and I'll come back later and we will finish this off. I am briefly back just to show you what I'm doing with the nebula. I'm taking the red cabbage and I'm going over the first 2 layers of red cabbage that are on here, just to add more of a pop of color. And again, I'm just smacking the side of my brush against the paper. You know, this may be a galaxy, but there's no rocket science involved. It is a very simple process, and it's meditative too. But this is how you can get brighter colors in your galaxies. Just use more than 1 layer and just keep layering the same color on top of itself as you work your galaxy. And if you see little white areas starting to show up, you may want to leave it, because remember, in outer space, you get those gases, and they can show up as white little clouds. So I actually like this look, and I'm hoping that once it dries, it'll stay. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You just don't know. And again, I'm just working the red cabbage out into that smoke tree in the corner here to give me kind of a darker purple. Now I'm going to dry this, and we'll see what we have. I have 2 tips for you regarding use of a heat gun. First of all, it's really important to keep the heat gun about 2 to 3 inches away from the surface of your paper, because remember, this area gets very, very hot, and you don't want to burn the paint or the paper. Also, be constantly moving the heat gun as you're using it. Don't just let it sit over one area, because again, you'll burn the paint and or the paper. Just use small circular motions and move across your painting. And you may have noticed at the end of that quick time lapse there that I went along the edges. I did that very slowly. And the reason I did that, there's 2 reasons. One is that water will collect here, and you want that water to dry, because when you're working further on your painting, you don't want that water, to cause an issue. And also, it's for the adhesive on the tape, so that when I go to remove the tape when I'm done with my painting, it will lift a lot easier, because adhesive does not hold up well to heat. So you go along the edges here, and then when you peel your paper off, it should come off easier. So that's my tips for using a heat gun. So now we have our painting, and it's fairly dry. It's still a little bit damp. The paper underneath is damp. I can kind of feel it, but the surface is dry. Now I'm going to add my stars. And again, I'm using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, but if you have white acrylic paint, that'll work just fine. Just water it down a little bit, and I'll show you the ideal consistency you should have for splattering your stars across your galaxy. So we've done Helen's prompt of a galaxy, and now we're doing her prompt for splatters. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to dip the tip of my brush into the bleed proof white here. You don't need very much at all. And I'm just going to take it and rub it into the lid and use this lid as a little palette. Okay. Now, when it's thick like this, it's not going to spatter very well. See, barely anything is coming off my brush. But if you want some really teeny tiny stars, this is what you do. Don't add any water, and you just spatter them kind of where you want them. I mean, they're basically going to go where they're going to go. You can control it to a certain degree, because nebulas are filled with millions of baby stars. That's where stars are born. And so you're going to want those teeny tiny stars in the center of your nebula. And of course, you're going to get the bleed proof white all over your finger, but hey, that's us artists, we always have stuff on our fingers. So if you can see this, There are teeny tiny stars. And now I'm going to want to add some bigger stars. In order to do that, I go back to my lid here and I'm going to add just a little bit of water. I mean, like literally a drop, okay? You don't want it to add a lot of water because then it'll be too watery and your stars will leave really large splatters that will ruin your galaxy. And you just dip the tip of your brush in and mix it. So there is pretty much the consistency. It's not running, it's not dripping along the lid, but it's still really wet, and it's not dripping off my brush either. And I just mix it, make sure it is well onto the bristles, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to take my finger and I'm going to flick it, rub those bristles, and look, I'm getting slightly larger stars. If you can see that. So let me see if I can, there we go. See how pretty that looks? I've had people tell me, oh, you put too many stars in your galaxies. And I'm like, no, I don't. There's millions and millions of stars. We just can't see them due to all the light pollution on our planet. If you go out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, you will be amazed looking up at the night sky. See, here are the stars. And again, you can add as many as you like. You know, it's individual preference. And I'm going to add just a little bit more here up in this corner, down here. And there are the splatters. And here is your watercolor galaxy. And then what you would do is remove the tape. And I just want to show you the effect that this gives in using painter's tape. Usually, as long as you don't get any water beneath the tape, it will leave you with a very nice straight edge. And as you're removing your tape, go slowly and move the tape, pull it away from your painting. Do not pull it like this toward the painting because that will rip the paper, that will ruin your painting. Always pull it away and hold the paper down with another finger. This is where some water got underneath. I'll show you how to fix that. Oh, quite a bit. Okay. And then we go across the top. Let me move my water containers. And again, you're pulling up and away from the paint. Up and away. And there you go. And I'm not going to remove this last piece of tape because I'm going to use the other side of this paper for something else here. Now to fix this, all you do is you take your bleed-proof white and dip your brush in it a little bit and cover it up. Let me zoom in a bit. And, you know, again, it's very, it's a light application, and you'll have to go over it in several coats. You know, that's actually not working too well. I would need a cheapy brush. Let me grab a cheap brush. Here's an inexpensive brush. It came with a set of store-bought paints. So again, I'll just dip it a little bit into the P.H. Martins here. And I will go over this and gradually cover it up. But that's what you do. And again, it's going to take 2, maybe 3 coats. It depends on how dark the color is and how much paint is there on the paper. But this is pretty much how you paint a watercolor galaxy. If you have any questions about this, let me know. For all my returning subscribers, I thank you for coming back to my channel. I hope that you enjoyed this journaling collaboration with Helen. And go and check out her YouTube to see what she did for her part of the collaboration. And follow her on Instagram, and she does have a Patreon. I have a Patreon also. Mine is more centered around tarot and magical things, but I am going to be posting Patreon exclusive tutorials over there very soon. But there you go. Also, one last thing you can do to your galaxy if you want is get a white gel pen and add some larger stars with your pen, if you like. And that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions about it or would like to see a tutorial on something else, let me know in the comments below. And thank you for watching, and I wish you all a blessed day. This is Nefer Kefri, the Positive Vibes Artist.